No verified recording, transcript, or contemporary report from any NBA-covered outlet, wire service, or later retrospective documentary establishes a specific argument between two named legends that was filmed at an All-Star weekend and then deliberately kept off the broadcast. A documentary script cannot invent that scene, the words exchanged, or a commissioner's order to erase it, no matter how well it might fit the title. What the record does support is the real story behind the speculation this title is built on, and that story does not need an invented confrontation to carry real weight. Earvin Magic Johnson announced on November 7, 1991, that he had tested positive for HIV and was retiring from the Los Angeles Lakers immediately. The announcement came at a moment when public understanding of the virus was limited and often driven by fear rather than medical fact. At a time when much of the American public still associated an HIV diagnosis primarily with intravenous drug use, or with the gay community specifically, a misconception Johnson's own public profile as a heterosexual superstar athlete directly complicated. Public health researchers later pointed to a measurable rise in HIV testing rates in the weeks following his announcement. One of the clearest examples of a single celebrity disclosure changing public behavior around a health issue. Johnson's decision to speak publicly about his diagnosis reshaped how the disease was discussed in American media for years afterward. 3 months later, fans voted him in as a starter for the 1992 All-Star Game in Orlando, despite his retirement, a result the league had no mechanism to prevent and did not attempt to overturn. Some players and league officials privately expressed concern before the game about Johnson competing at all, reflecting the same public misunderstanding of HIV transmission that his announcement was already working to correct. Some of that hesitation surfaced publicly in the days before the game, with a handful of players quoted describing discomfort about potential contact on the floor.
Everything I do is for the kids. I support my hometown 100%. I never forget where I'm always going to support y'all.
Comments that drew criticism from doctors and public health officials who used the moment to reiterate that the virus could not spread through the kind of incidental contact a basketball game involved. Those concerns did not stop the game from proceeding as planned, and Johnson's own comments in the lead-up to the weekend focused on wanting to be treated as a basketball player rather than as a symbol. Even while his presence on the floor inevitably carried symbolic weight, neither he nor the league could fully separate from the competition itself. Johnson played in that game on February 9, 1992, and won the Most Valuable Player award with 25 points, including a three-pointer late in the contest that sent the crowd into a standing ovation before the final buzzer had even sounded.
Harry coming to my game, so we got it all together, and we had the game, sold the building out, had a good time. The fans just went.
The West defeated the East 153-113. Isaiah Thomas played in that same game, representing the East, and the two men guarded each other in visible stretches of live action throughout the afternoon. Footage that shows ordinary competitive basketball between them, rather than any sign of the avoidance a scripted feud would require. Johnson's late three-pointer came directly over a defender in that same East backcourt, and the broadcast crew called the shot as the signature moment of a performance that had already exceeded what anyone expected from a player who had not competed in an NBA game in 3 months. Television cameras captured players from both teams, opponents included, coming together to embrace him once the final horn went off, a moment widely replayed in the years since as one of the most emotional scenes in the history of the event.
All right, we'll keep this thing rolling. All right.
None of that required a hidden confrontation to be a significant piece of sports history. The public record of that specific afternoon is already remarkable on its own, built around a comeback few had thought was possible only months earlier, and a performance that gave the league one of its defining images of the decade. The genuine tension between Johnson and Isiah Thomas is real, but it is documented far more cautiously than a scripted tunnel confrontation allows. Thomas was left off the roster for the 1992 United States Olympic team, the group that became known as the Dream Team, a decision that generated significant public debate at the time, and that has been widely, though not universally, attributed in later reporting to friction between Thomas and several of his peers, Jordan chief among them. The roster itself, a mix of active NBA superstars headlined by Johnson, Jordan, Larry Bird, and Charles Barkley, drew constant national attention through the months leading into the Barcelona Olympics that summer. And the visible absence of a player with Thomas's championship resume, 2 titles with the Detroit Pistons, and a run of all-star selections, made the question of why he was left off the list one of the most persistent basketball storylines of that entire year. Johnson has spoken in later interviews about a strained period in his relationship with Thomas following his diagnosis, without ever attaching that strain to one specific scripted exchange captured on camera and suppressed.
Little clinic just for kids to get involved, giving back, and I think that you becoming a great athlete is that's giving back, and so that's what I wanted to do.
Thomas, for his part, has publicly denied any role in spreading rumors about how Johnson contracted the virus, a denial that remains part of the public record alongside the suspicion it was meant to answer.
5 on the shot clock. Thomas. Unbelievable. Was on that shot.
Media coverage from that period shows the two men still capable of ordinary, cordial public interaction, even amid the private strain. Photographs and broadcast footage from around the league that season show them competing against each other without visible incident, a detail that complicates any account built around a single dramatic rupture. Friendships built over a decade of shared championship runs and joint business ventures, including real, well-documented commercial partnerships the two men built together during their playing careers, do not typically end in one recorded scene.
Edge, how do you feel when people look at the Celtics team and they say, oh, they're a star?
It's disrespectful.
Fast forward.
They erode gradually through disagreements neither side fully explains to outsiders, which is a harder story to tell in 3 minutes, but the one both men have actually described when asked about it directly.
His face shook. Panic, no fear. But we're having.
Johnson's return in Orlando followed a career that had already made him one of the most decorated players of his era. 5 championships with the Lakers across the 1980s, and 3 regular season MVP awards, a resume that made his sudden November retirement feel like the abrupt end of a story that was supposed to still have several chapters left. The All-Star Game gave the public a version of that missing chapter, a single afternoon rather than a full season, and it became the primary way an entire generation of fans got to see him compete again after the diagnosis had seemed to close that door permanently.
We gonna help her out. Y'all give it up for Flex Alexander. Yes, sir.
Johnson would go on to a brief comeback attempt with the Lakers in 1996, appearing in 32 regular season games before retiring again. But the 1992 All-Star performance remained the moment most closely associated with his return to competitive basketball after the diagnosis.
In my game, I already had Larry Bird, so you know you got to play. MJ came out and flew all, man.
Both men have discussed the distance that grew between them in interviews given years after their playing careers ended, describing a friendship that cooled without either man offering a single dramatic scene as the explanation. That kind of account, a relationship that changed gradually rather than through one filmed confrontation, is both more common in real life and far more difficult to turn into a clean 3-minute video segment. It is also the version supported by what Johnson and Thomas have actually said on the record, rather than a version built around a hotel lobby snub, a tunnel shouting match, and a commissioner's office ordering evidence destroyed, none of which any available source confirms happened. Johnson's life after the diagnosis moved in a direction the 1992 season could not have fully predicted. He founded the Magic Johnson Foundation shortly after his announcement, directing significant resources toward HIV and AIDS education and research at a time when public funding and attention for the epidemic remained a contested political issue. He has now lived with the diagnosis for more than 3 decades, a survival that itself became a form of public education about advances in antiretroviral treatment developed through the 1990s and 2000s. Standing in visible contrast to the widespread assumption at the time of his announcement, echoed across news coverage in November 1991 that the diagnosis amounted to a short-term death sentence. That longer arc, from a locker room announcement that shocked the sports world to decades of public advocacy, is the through line connecting the 1992 All-Star Game to the rest of Johnson's life, a connection that needs no invented tunnel confrontation to feel significant. The honest version of this story is smaller than the title promises, and that is the correct outcome when the alternative is inventing a confrontation between 2 real people around one of the most sensitive moments in either man's life. What remains true and fully documented is enough on its own. A superstar's HIV diagnosis, a public return to the sport just months later, an MVP performance that became one of the sport's most emotional broadcasts, and a real, later acknowledged strain in a friendship that both men have discussed honestly, on their own terms, without a script written for them decades after the fact.